The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I made my way down the overgrown path. Late October in Sleepy Hollow brought an early dusk, the pale afternoon sun barely penetrating through a canopy of skeletal oak trees. Their branches reached out like gnarled fingers against the pewter sky, creating shifting shadows that seemed to follow my every move. The air hung thick and static, unnaturally still. No birds called, no leaves rustled, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps breaking the oppressive silence. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more pronounced the smell became. A metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies left too long in the sun, or something darker, blood long dried and forgotten. I'd heard all the stories at Murphy's Pub, where locals gathered to share their whispered warnings over pints of warm beer. Old Mrs. Davidson, the widow who lived in the Victorian house at the edge of town, swore she heard voices rising from the well on moonless nights. 3 kids had gone missing near here in the past decade. The police blamed it on the treacherous terrain and the abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the area, but the townspeople knew better. They spoke of curses, of ancient things that lived in the deep places of the earth. The well appeared suddenly around a bend in the path, like it had been waiting for me. Its stones were worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, covered in a latticework of moss that spread like green veins across the ancient surface. The opening gaped like a mouth, pitch black against the gathering gloom. That's when I noticed the backpack. It lay slumped against the well's base, partially hidden under a tangle of thorny vines. The fabric was expensive, North Face maybe, but now it was torn and dirty, the straps frayed as if they'd been cut by something sharp. What caught my eye was the stain spreading across the bottom, a deep, ugly crimson that made my stomach turn. I glanced around, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The woods remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It felt expectant, like an audience holding its breath before the curtain rises. With trembling hands, I crouched down and unzipped the bag. The zipper's sound seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. Inside, I found a shattered iPhone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks still showing a final unanswered text. "Where are you? Please answer." Beneath it lay scraps of torn clothing and a leather-bound book. The book looked ancient, its cover cracked and worn like old skin. Strange symbols were etched into the spine, not any language I recognized, but somehow familiar, like something seen in a half-remembered dream. The symbols seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them, making my eyes water and my head spin. The temperature dropped several degrees as I opened the book. Most pages were blank, the parchment yellow and brittle, smelling of dust and decay. But on the final page, I found writing. 6 rules scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting that spoke of fear and urgency. The rules. Rule 1. Never open the book after sundown. Rule 2. If you hear a whisper near the well, do not look into it. Rule 3. Avoid the cemetery after midnight. The gravestones aren't always empty. Rule 4. If you see your reflection in the book's cover, do not touch the book for an hour. Rule 5. Always return the book to the exact spot where you found it before sunrise. Rule 6. Never burn the book. The last rule was underlined 3 times, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had been shaking uncontrollably. Dark spots stained the page, whether tears or blood, I couldn't tell. A sudden gust of wind stirred the trees, and I jerked my head up, heart pounding. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a dark shape ducking behind a tree. But when I looked directly, nothing was there except shadows and silence. The sun was sinking faster now, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges. I shoved the book into the backpack and slung it over my shoulder, trying to ignore how warm it felt against my back. As I hurried back toward town, the crunch of my footsteps seemed to echo with a second set of steps, always just slightly out of sync with my own. The antique clock in my rented room at the Sleepy Hollow Inn ticked relentlessly toward midnight. I sat at the weathered oak desk, my laptop's glow casting strange shadows across the walls. The book lay before me, its leather cover seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Steam rose from my untouched cup of coffee, curling in patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the symbols on the spine. The room itself was a relic of the past century. Faded floral wallpaper peeling at the corners, a brass bed frame that creaked with every movement, and windows sealed with layers of ancient paint. The air hung thick with the musty scent of old books and something else, something metallic that reminded me of the well. I'd been trying to distract myself with work, answering emails, scrolling through social media, but my eyes kept drifting back to the book. The first rule echoed in my mind: never open the book after sundown. The weight of those words pressed against my consciousness like a physical thing. The radiator in the corner hissed and clanked, making me jump. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the cobblestones 3 stories below. Their scratching against the window sounded almost like whispered words. Then I heard it, my name, soft and deliberate, like someone exhaling directly into my ear. Ethan. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound had come from near the window, but that was impossible. My room was on the 3rd floor, and the ancient fire escape had been removed years ago. Ethan. The whisper came again, louder this time, accompanied by a soft tapping against the glass. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The curtains, heavy velvet things that had probably been hanging there since the Carter administration, swayed slightly, though there was no draft. Condensation had formed on the glass, running down in rivulets that seemed to form and reform into almost recognizable shapes before dissolving again. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. Each step toward the window felt like walking through molasses. The darkness beyond the glass seemed alive, writhing and shifting under the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. The tapping continued, more insistent now. Something moved in that darkness, a suggestion of form, a hint of features that were almost human but wrong somehow, like a face seen underwater and distorted by the ripples. My hand reached for the curtain, fingers trembling. The second rule suddenly flashed through my mind. If you hear a whisper near the well, do not look into it. The well, the whispers. They had followed me here. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the desk chair. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices all saying my name in slightly different tones, slightly different rhythms, like a twisted round of supernatural singing. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the inside of the window, spreading in crystalline patterns that mimicked the symbols from the book's spine. The whispers continued until dawn, keeping me huddled in the corner, watching as shadows danced across the ceiling and wondering what I had brought back with me from that well. When the first gray light of morning finally crept through the window, I found deep scratches in the glass, scratches that spelled out my name in reverse, as if carved from the outside looking in. Morning light filtered through the branches as I made my way back into the woods. The backpack felt heavier than yesterday, the book inside radiating an unnatural warmth through the fabric. I told myself I was going to return it to the well, end this nightmare before it got worse. But something else pulled at me, a need to understand, to unravel the mystery behind those rules. I stopped in a small clearing where sunlight pooled on a carpet of dead leaves. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of decay and wet earth. Birds called in the distance, but their songs sounded wrong, discordant, like a record played at the wrong speed. The book seemed to pulse in my hands as I pulled it from the bag. Its leather cover was warm, almost hot to the touch, and the strange symbols appeared to writhe under my fingers. Beads of sweat formed on my forehead despite the autumn chill. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my reflection in the polished leather, distorted by the uneven surface. But something was wrong. The face staring back at me moved independently, its expressions out of sync with my own. Its eyes were darker, pupils expanded until barely any white remained. As I watched, frozen in horror, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, lips curling into a smile that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that looked sharp and numerous. The fourth rule thundered through my mind. If you see your reflection in the book's cover, do not touch the book for an hour. I dropped it like it had burned me. The book hit the ground with a thud that seemed to echo through the woods, stirring up leaves and sending a flock of crows bursting from the trees, their harsh cries filling the air. For the next hour, I sat on a fallen log, keeping my distance from the book. The reflection remained visible on the cover, watching me with those inhuman eyes. Sometimes it would move, reaching out as if pressing against glass, or mouthing words I couldn't understand. Once, I swore I saw something else in the background of its world, a towering shape made of shadows and angles that hurt my eyes to look at. The shadows in the clearing grew longer as clouds gathered overhead. A wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant church bells, though I knew there wasn't a church for miles. The reflection turned its head toward the sound, then back to me, its smile widening impossibly further. When the hour finally passed, I approached the book cautiously. The reflection was gone, but the leather felt different under my fingers, softer, almost like skin. And as I picked it up, I could have sworn I felt a pulse beneath its surface, beating in perfect time with my own heart. The sun had set by the time I returned to my room, casting the town in deep shadows. I shoved the book deep into the blood-stained backpack, throwing it in the corner where it sat like a dark presence. But as midnight approached, an inexplicable compulsion gripped me, a pressure building in my chest that pulled me toward the cemetery. The third rule screamed in my mind: avoid the cemetery after midnight. The gravestones aren't always empty. Yet my feet moved of their own accord. I found myself walking through the iron gates of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, the rusted hinges shrieking in protest. Mist clung to the ground, thick and unnatural, swirling around my ankles like ghostly fingers. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying flowers, and something else, something old and sweet, like rotting fruit. Ancient oak trees loomed overhead, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. My flashlight beam caught fragments of weathered stone, angels with eroded faces, Celtic crosses covered in lichen, family crypts with doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. The oldest section of the cemetery lay at its heart, where colonial-era gravestones tilted at odd angles, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by centuries of rain and wind. My flashlight played across the dates: 1692, 1703, 1684. Then the beam caught something that made my blood freeze. A new gravestone, pristine among its weathered neighbors. The name carved into the granite made my stomach lurch. Ethan Mallory. My name. The date of death read November 18th, 2023. Today's date. The sound came from behind me, the soft scrape of stone against stone. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Nothing. But the sounds continued, growing louder. The mist thickened, taking on shapes that were almost human, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that defied anatomy. Voices rose from the ground itself, speaking in a language that made my ears hurt and my vision blur. The shadows between the graves deepened, writhing like living things. As I watched, frozen in horror, pale hands began emerging from those shadows, reaching upward with elongated fingers and blackened nails. I turned to run, but the mist had become almost solid, clinging to my legs and slowing my movements. The voices grew louder, their otherworldly language becoming a chorus of screams and whispers. Shapes moved in my peripheral vision, things that walked on too many legs, faces that shifted and changed with every blink. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice sounding thin and weak against the supernatural cacophony. For a moment, everything stopped. The mist retreated, the shadows stilled, and the voices fell silent. Then I heard it, a single whisper, clear as day in my own voice. "You can't leave. You're already here." I ran. Past crumbling angels and tilted crosses, through gates that seemed to reach for me with iron fingers. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, slamming the door and collapsing against it. But even there, I could still hear them. Those voices singing their ancient songs beneath the floorboards, calling my name in the darkness. 1:13 a.m. The antique clock's ticking echoed through my room when the knocking started. Knock, knock, knock. Precise, deliberate, each knock exactly 3 seconds apart. I remained frozen on the floor where I'd collapsed after fleeing the cemetery, my back pressed against the door's peeling paint. Sweat trickled down my spine despite the room's bone-chilling cold. "Ethan." The voice wasn't human. It resonated like metal grinding against metal, a sound that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, materializing directly in my brain. "Ethan, open the door." My hands clamped over my ears, but it made no difference. The voice was inside my head now, each word sending spikes of pain through my skull. The rules tumbled through my mind, but none addressed this situation. What happens when the rules themselves aren't enough? The knocking stopped. In that sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing, too loud in the stillness. The old radiator hissed in the corner, its shadows dancing across the faded wallpaper like writhing snakes. Thud. The door shuddered in its frame, wood splintering around the hinges. The impact sent me scrambling across the room, my hand instinctively grabbing the blood-stained backpack. The book inside pulsed with unnatural warmth, almost burning through the fabric. When I pulled it out, the leather cover gleamed in the dim light from the street lamp outside. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't alone anymore. Behind it loomed a shape made of darkness and angles that shouldn't exist, its form shifting and twisting in ways that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. The reflection smiled. That same wrong smile, too wide and full of needle-sharp teeth. It raised one hand and pressed it against the inside of the cover, leaving a print that smoked and sizzled on the leather. Another thud rattled the door, harder this time. The frame cracked, splinters of wood scattering across the floor. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath hanging in the air, crystallizing into patterns that matched the symbols on the book's spine. The voice had changed, becoming a chorus of whispers in different pitches, some high and keening, others deep and guttural. You read the rules. You knew the price. Slowly, inevitably, the doorknob began to turn. Metal groaned and warped, the brass taking on a dull, organic sheen like old bone. Dark liquid seeped from around the edges, dripping onto the floor with a hiss that left small craters in the wooden boards. The door opened with a sound like a dying breath. What stood in the doorway wasn't anything that had ever been human. It was darkness given form, a void shaped into something that only approximated humanity. Where its face should have been, symbols writhed and twisted. The same symbols from the book's spine, now burning with an inner light that hurt to look at. It reached for me with hands that were too long, too jointed, fingers ending in points that left smoking trails in the air. The book grew hotter in my grasp, its pulse now racing, synchronizing with my own terrified heartbeat. I backed away until I hit the window, the cold glass a shock against my spine. 3 stories up, but in that moment, the fall seemed preferable to whatever waited in my doorway. The thing took another step forward, its movement liquid and wrong, like watching a spider unfold in reverse. The shadows in the room bent toward it, drawn by its presence like iron filings to a magnet. "Time to read the final chapter," it said, its voice now a symphony of screams. Dawn approached with an unnatural red glow, the sun a bloody eye peering through skeletal trees. The whispers had grown constant, a chorus of voices speaking in languages that made my ears bleed. The 5th rule burned in my mind. Always return the book to the exact spot where you found it before sunrise. The woods felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Trees had shifted position overnight, creating new paths that led in impossible directions. The air was thick with fog that moved against the wind, forming shapes that almost resembled faces before dissolving. The book pulsed in my hands like a living heart. Its cover had changed. The leather now felt wet and warm, the symbols moving freely across its surface like swimming creatures. Dark liquid dripped from its pages, leaving smoking holes in the fallen leaves beneath my feet. When I reached the well, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The stones were slick with something that wasn't dew, the moss now black and pulsating. From its depths came a sound, not water, but something massive moving in the darkness below. My hands trembled as I placed the book on the well's edge, exactly where the backpack had been. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the book began to vibrate, its symbols glowing with an inner light that cast strange shadows on the surrounding trees. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. A deep, guttural sound rose from the well, a sound no human throat could make, like ancient stones grinding together mixed with the screams of something vast and hungry. The ground trembled beneath my feet. Cracks appeared in the soil, spreading outward from the well like black veins. I turned to run, but something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle, a tendril of pure darkness, slick and strong, pulling me toward the well's mouth. More tendrils emerged, each one moving with terrible purpose. They were composed of shadow given substance, dripping with the same dark liquid that had leaked from the book. Where the drops fell on my skin, they burned like acid, leaving marks in the shape of the book's symbols. The thing in the well was rising, bringing with it the smell of age and decay, of things that had never seen sunlight. The air grew colder, and frost formed on the surrounding trees, creating patterns that matched the symbols now branded into my flesh. Back in my room, soaked and shaking, I stared at the book. The final rule taunted me. Never burn the book. The old radiator wheezed as I pulled out the can of lighter fluid from beneath my bathroom sink. My hands trembled as I doused the book, the liquid seeming to be absorbed into the leather rather than running off. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing with an angry red light. The match shook between my fingers as I struck it. For a moment, the flame danced, casting wild shadows across the walls. Something moved in those shadows, faces pressing against them like dark hands against fabric, mouths opening in silent screams. I dropped the match. The book erupted in flames that burned black instead of orange, consuming the leather with unnatural speed. Thick, acrid smoke filled the room, carrying the stench of burning flesh and something older, something that smelled like the bottom of that well. For one glorious moment, I felt relief. Then the ashes began to move. They swirled upward, defying gravity, forming shapes in the air. First symbols like those on the spine, then faces contorted in agony. The temperature in the room plummeted until ice crystals formed on the windows, creating patterns that matched the burning symbols. A sound filled the room, like thousands of voices screaming in harmony. The ashes condensed, taking form. Something tall and dark, with too many limbs and a face that was nothing but angles and void. It reached for me with hands made of smoke and shadow, each finger ending in a point of absolute darkness. "You broke the final rule," it said, its voice a chorus of the damned. "Now you belong to us." The shadows in the room stretched toward me like grasping hands, and I felt myself being pulled into darkness deeper than any natural night. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the icy window, smiling that wrong smile, waving goodbye with too many fingers. The cemetery glowed with an otherworldly light as I found myself there again, though I had no memory of walking. The mist was thicker than before, swirling with purpose, forming shapes that mimicked human forms before dissolving back into nothingness. My gravestone stood pristine among the weathered markers, its surface gleaming as if wet. The engraving was deeper now, the letters filled with something dark that seemed to move. Ethan Mallory, November 18th, 2023. He broke the rules. Below the inscription, symbols identical to those from the book's spine crawled across the granite like living things. They shifted and changed as I watched, telling stories in a language that hurt to look at, but that I somehow understood. Stories of ancient things that lived in deep places, of rules written in blood and bone, of prices paid in souls rather than coins. The ground before the stone was disturbed, freshly dug, a perfect rectangle of dark earth that seemed to breathe in time with my own ragged breaths. Something moved beneath that soil, something that wore my face but wasn't me. Other voices joined the whispers now. I recognized them as the missing people from town, their words twisted into that same terrible language. They spoke of the well, of the book, of rules broken and prices paid. The shadows around me solidified, taking forms that shouldn't exist in any sane world. They converged on the grave, their many hands reaching down into the earth, beckoning. And I understood with terrible clarity, this wasn't just my grave. It was my new home. The world shifted and blurred around me as sunset approached. The whispers had grown deafening, a cacophony of voices speaking in that terrible language I now understood too well. The air felt heavy, crushing, as though reality itself was collapsing inward. The well appeared before me, though I hadn't walked there. Its stones were black now, wet with something that wasn't water. The symbols from the book had spread across its surface, glowing with an inner light that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Dark tendrils rose from its depths, more solid than before, moving with terrible purpose. They formed shapes, faces I recognized from the missing persons reports, bodies twisted into impossible angles. Each one reached for me with hands made of shadow and void. My reflection appeared in the well's depths, but it wasn't alone. Behind it stood the thing from my room, its form now fully revealed. a mass of darkness and angles that hurt to look at, wearing my smile on a face made of void. It reached up with too many hands, beckoning. "You're home now," it whispered in that chorus of damned voices. "The rules are part of you." The symbols burned themselves into my skin, writing new rules in a language older than time. As the darkness pulled me down, I saw my reflection one last time, smiling that wrong smile, eyes black and endless, becoming one with the things that lived in the deep places of the earth. The last thing I wrote was this warning: there are rules in this world. Some are meant to be broken, but some, when broken, break you in return.